the Jaipur Literature Festival. So yeah, it's pretty good. And I'm Sirish Rao. I'm the host of Charbagh for the next few days, so you'll see me around. I produce a festival called Indian Summer in Vancouver, Canada, together with teamwork who produced Jaipur. So you're all welcome if you ever want to come to the other side of the world. Meanwhile, I hope you enjoy the next few days here and on other stages. There's wonderful, wonderful treats in store for you. Before we get started with our next session, which I'm very excited about, there's a lot of people to thank for a festival that is free in many ways. Free in terms of the ideas it expresses, free in the fact that it doesn't charge an admission fee. So we'd like to thank Z, our title sponsors, for their support and also for giving the festival a certain je ne sais quoi. Google, British Airways, Harvard, Ford, Rajasthan Tourism, the Public Diplomacy Division of India, the National Jute Board, the American Center, Foundation Jan Mikulski, British Council, I'm out of breath here, Digi Palace, Brew, Vodafone, Clark's Hammer, Coca-Cola, Fortis Hospitals, Penguin India, Dove, the Glenlivet, Kingfisher, good stuff, Full Circle Bookstore, Le Méridien, Rambagh Palace, Rajasthan Patrika, Hindustan Times, DNA, Dainik Bhaskar, The Telegraph, Radio Mirchi, Twitter, what would we do without them, Kiazunga, the official decor partner, Royal Decor, hospitality partners, ITC, the Oberoi, and many, many other people who made this possible. So, we also just want to make sure that you keep your mobile phones on silent, which also means don't take calls. In addition to that, if you need to take a call, please leave the stage. Try and keep it as clean as possible. Pick up litter that you see around you and give us a hand. And we'd also like to request that during question hour you respect the moderator's directions and do indeed ask a question rather than a soliloquy. That would be fantastic. And with that, I'm very, very proud to say that our first session is with the wonderful Jonathan Franzen and the wonderful Chandrahas Choudhury. Please give them a big hand. So while we mic them up, I'd just like to introduce our moderator for today, Chandrahas Choudhury. A lot of you will have seen him at Jaipur before and many other platforms, and we'll see him at several sessions again. He's the author of Arzi the Dwarf, which came out in India in 2009, but more recently, I think just last year in the US. He writes widely. His reviews appear in the New York Times and the Washington Post and journals all over. And he's also the fiction poetry editor of the fine literary magazine Caravan. So thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Chandrahas, for being with us. And over to both of you. Again, a big hand for these two wonderful gentlemen for kicking off the festival.
You know what? These lights give heat. It's really nice. We've got the best seats in the house.
Well, Jonathan, welcome to Jaipur. I know you've only just arrived this morning. For someone who's not got any sleep, you're looking very awake. And I noticed that you've got a backpack along, Jonathan. You're looking like a techie from Bangalore.
That's me, a techie from Bangalore.
Well, everybody, I'd like to say it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you at the new edition of the festival the writer of maybe the first great novel of the 21st century, The Corrections, a book that took one of the oldest templates in literature, the novel about the family, and doused it in the spirit and in the obsessions of our times and made it look like it had never been done before. So Jonathan, I have lots of questions to ask you, some of them just curiosity personally about novelistic technique. I'm asked just for myself and not for anybody else. But To begin,
Chandrahas promised this would be a technical conversation, and I was delighted to hear it.
great. I also meant you do a great job of pronouncing my name, but if at all you have any difficulty, just call me Oprah.
That was cheap,
I agree.
Oprah.
Okay, serious stuff now. Well, you know, when you look at the history of the novel, the history of the novel is connected in some way to the history of the modern self. But when you read the corrections, you kind of begin to wonder if we've been going down the wrong path all along, and it's not self that's the first word of the novel, but maybe family. You think that there's anything in that?
I'll preface my remark by saying I've been in transit since Wednesday morning in San Francisco, and have come straight here. So that's a wonderfully difficult first question. No. I don't think so. I mean, obviously, the great family stories go back as far as we have record of people telling stories. All the great religions, they're amazing family stories. The myths, they're all about mom, dad, animals that are also part of the family somehow. So, but no, I think individual subjectivity is and the whole notion of an individual mattering, that notion was being developed on a broad scale. You could call it a middle-class scale at the same time the novel was being developed. We may talk about this more tomorrow.
Yeah.
We talk about the way the novel took over the world. So I think the individual still is at the center of it.
Well, the thing though about the book is that you begin by being dropped into the world of one of the other characters, and as it draws along, you suddenly begin to somehow feel that they're not completely in control of what they're doing. And there's this undertow always of another Lambert, for every Lambert. And that, I think, is one of the really pleasurable bits about reading it, but also slightly terrifying.
Yeah, it took me a while to fully figure out what I was doing as a novelist. And it was in the corrections that I put it together for the first time that I have a very hard time writing about myself. Every time I put myself on a page, I start not liking the character. And so I try to, so the thing is either this shameful confession of what a bad person I am, or else it seems I'm being overly generous to myself and I'm talking about how great I am, and it's never worked. And I think part of that has to do with my not having a center as a person. It's weird. I mean, I just talked about the individual being at the center,
Yeah.
but I felt like I had this multiplicity of selves, and it came from my position in my own family, I think, where there were these 4 other incredibly strong characters, all different, all of whom had problems with each of the others, and they all came to me, and they told me what was going on with them, and there was just no room for the little kid, really. It was my business to listen to what these 4 strong characters were doing. And so the great thing about a novel is that once you get a story going, you can actually keep it going for 500 pages. And in 500 pages, a whole lot can happen. You can have, suddenly 20 years can go by. Which is what Shakespeare started to do in his proto-novels, the romances, the late Shakespeare plays. All of those turned on, what made them novel-like was that there's action at the beginning, and then years go by, and everything is different when you pick it up 15, 20 years later. And it's the same thing when you get a multiplicity of subjectivities going in a novel. You get Enid Lambert's point of view on the children, but then you can actually turn it around and see what she looks like to them. And that's like the glory of the novel. drives the film adapters crazy, but
yeah, maybe the reason why it drives the film adapters crazy is that whenever we think of characters in a certain field in a novel, we always undercount by one because we miss the narrator.
well, that's definitely a problem, yes.
And what do you do in cinema unless you put voiceovers on
and we know how well that works.
Yeah, that's right. And I meant to ask you then, because the wonderful thing about the corrections and about freedom too is that, you know, it's always a choice of the narrator how much to reveal or how much to hide about somebody. And you sometimes really go full on in trying to, in letting everyone know what the narrator thinks about a person. And so the kind of exposure that happens there is, they're completely laid bare, their selves are laid bare. And what is that part of your method, you think?
You know, when I was coming up in the 70s and in high school, in the 80s in college and as a young writer, that was very much the heyday of the short story, and particularly the Raymond Carver short story. And what I remember being told already in 6th grade, and when I would read, you know, How to Be a Writer books, which was kind of how I learned to be a writer, they all said, show, don't tell. So you're supposed to have lots of little actions, this kind of, you know, seen from without and deduce what's going on inside. And again, this was kind of the book where I started to unlearn that lesson, and I realized the very word storytelling has telling in it. It's not story showing, it's storytelling, and that you could actually, that there was room for a correction of a kind from that very, very simple, spare, distant showing, and that certain other kinds of fun things began to happen, like irony and the tone of the narrator's voice, and the interplay between what's going on in the character's mind and then sort of stepping back to say, and a week later, and then say, this, and this happened to him. And again, this is the specialty of the novel. You can step out for a paragraph and be completely narrating, just telling, and then, like that, in half a sentence, you can snap deeply back into the interior of the character. And those were compensation for what you lost by being very, very disciplined and only showing.
That's right. So it hadn't struck me yet that the correction is also kind of narrative correction of a kind. You are sort of trying to bleed back into the novel something that it might have, the trend of the novel might have given up for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I was still a young person when I was doing it, and I was sort of crazily ambitious. But I did feel that the kind of fiction that was privileged in the Academy and in the award seasons had gotten to be a very, first of all, very white, very male enterprise, and it was what we would call postmodern now, although we're still postmodern, but we don't call ourselves postmodern anymore. We call ourselves post-postmodern. And if you read those texts of the people who I was told when I was 22, these are the guys, all guys. Maybe you had Angela Carter, but she was off in England. In America, there was a bunch of guys, and they were boy novels, concerned with big ideas and not so concerned with relationships. Not very good at depicting, well, women, people of color, any of that. They were, you know, concerned about the nuclear peril or the excesses of the capitalist system and all of that stuff. And I really wanted to try to get back. You can't go back to the 19th century because you can't unlearn modernism, and you shouldn't unlearn modernism because the self-consciousness about how a story is told, that's really valuable, and like some of the best art ever on the page came out of that modernist revolution beginning 1900 or so. You don't want to unlearn that, but that kind of, and interestingly, a lot of the things, a lot of what the moderns were doing, you look at Faulkner, you look at Joyce even, you certainly look at Kafka, they were writing about family. And it was really the postmoderns who started to forget about that stuff as they got farther from that 19th century preoccupation with the domestic, with relationships, with men and women, all of that. So yeah, there was a conscious wish to try to reclaim the strong ground that the novel had held in the 19th century. Yeah, certainly. And I was gonna do it all myself.
Do you want to read a bit from it and then?
Oh, read a bit from, okay, just a really short reading, because Chandrahas has prepared. I'm just going to hold up his questions here. We have some 27 minutes to get through about 90% of this, so I'll make it a short reading. Like a paragraph or two? Whatever. Okay, so this is the beginning of a section called The Failure. Down the long concourse they came unsteadily, Enid favoring her damaged hip, Alfred paddling at the air with loose-hinged hands and slapping the airport carpeting with poorly controlled feet, both of them carrying Nordic Pleasure Line's shoulder bags and concentrating on the floor in front of them, measuring out the hazardous distance 3 paces at a time. To anyone who saw them averting their eyes from the dark-haired New Yorkers careering past them, to anyone who caught a glimpse of Alfred's straw fedora looming at the height of Iowa corn on Labor Day, or the yellow wool of the slack stretching over Enid's outslung hip, it was obvious that they were Midwestern and intimidated. But to Chip Lambert, who was waiting for them just beyond the security checkpoint, they were killers. Well, it goes from there. Maybe that's enough. Just a little, that's a paragraph. Oh, thank you. That's about the right amount of applause for one paragraph.
Does that mean, Jonathan, you want to read some more?
No,
well, I'm going to force something upon you. And that leads into some questions I have for you, but I just felt it would be nice if everybody knew. I was reading this yesterday. I was revisiting some bits of the book I really liked, and you know, there's a section, I thought the middle section of the book was really fantastic. You never notice time go by. You can read it all night long. And there's this, by this time the reader has begun to become aware of how the book works. It's broken up into kind of interlocking novella kind of structure, and each one has a certain character as a focus, but of course the other Lambert's always revolving around him or her. And we get finally to Enid and Albert going on this cruise. And by now they're fixed in our imagination. Two people who are so helplessly old and so dependent, and suddenly we find ourselves with these people as young people who just meeting one another. And I thought it was tremendously beautiful when these people who've known each other their whole lives, and we only know them as knowing each other, suddenly they're strangers to one another. And I just thought perhaps you could read this one page about Enid when she first meets Al. Maybe you have to reorient yourself. I know it's been a while since you wrote it, and I just read it.
I'm going to read a random page from the corrections.
Yes.
The whole page? Or maybe just to the boarding house?
Yeah.
To the boarding house, a few years after the war, that would be the Second World War, came a young steel engineer newly transferred to St. Jude to manage a foundry. He was a full-lipped, thick-haired, well-muscled boy in a man's shape and a man's suits. The suits were themselves luxuriantly pleated wool beauties. Once or twice every night, serving dinner at the big round table, Enid glanced over her shoulder and caught him looking and made him blush. Al was Kansan. After 2 months, he found courage to take her skating. They drank cocoa, and he told her that human beings were born to suffer. He took her to a steel company Christmas party and told her that the intelligent were doomed to be tormented by the stupid. He was a good dancer and a good earner, however, and she kissed him in the elevator. Soon they were engaged, and they chastely rode a night train to McCook, Nebraska, to visit his aged parents. His father kept a slave whom he was married to. Cleaning Al's room in St. Jude, she found a much-handled volume of Schopenhauer with certain passages underlined. For example, and this is just Schopenhauer here, the pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. So that's how their marriage begins. Thank you, Arthur Schopenhauer.
And I meant to say, the last sentence of the following paragraph is Enid now thinking, life then became a matter waiting for Albert's personality to change.
Yes, exactly.
So what I really enjoyed about this bit is that...
I failed to read The Part He Liked Best. I'm sorry.
Well, what I really enjoyed about this was it begins to seem from the reader's viewpoint here that any two personalities coming together, there's some sort of inexorable law of how they're going to be together. Somebody's going to be more powerful, somebody's going to be less powerful. Schopenhauer may win in this marriage, as he eventually does, because 40 years later, Albert is still sort of thinking in Schopenhauerian terms. It's clearly a text which is very fundamental to his life. In a curious way, you can see that time is stronger than any personality. In some way, the way two people work together will sort of hold out for the rest of their lives together. And I always feel when you read, one of the big themes of the third-person realist novel is that the real theme of these books are not about people but about time, that time works in ways independent of any human intention. If that makes sense to you at all.
That's a deep question. I think it answers itself.
Okay, then I'll move on to something else. Well, I also meant, but the reason why I brought this scene up also was that, you know, I think you write very roomy, very big scenes, and this is clearly a part of your method and something that really works well in your books. You're not sure when you meet somebody at the start of a scene if they're going to be the same age when the scene ends. And that is part of the effect of how these books work, and I'm sure it's deliberate and there's some kind of thinking that goes into it.
Yeah, I don't know how the books are going to end when I start them. And so I have this almost mystical faith that if I'm desperately scrambling to figure a story out, unsure where it's going, then maybe it'll feel like an adventure to the reader.
That's good enough.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I also meant to ask you now, before you wrote the corrections, you were, I would guess, the biggest splash you made, and you've written about this publicly, that you felt that your first two novels were ignored, but when you wrote an essay about why they were ignored, or what you felt about the novel at that time, that made a big splash, the one that you published in Harper's in 1996. And I really think, independently of your own thoughts about your own work, it's one of the great love letters to the novel written in the 20th century. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
But there's some ideas in there that I found myself thinking about closely, but not necessarily agreeing, and I thought I'd bring them up. I mean, especially the bit where, and this is, you're now kind of identified with this line where you say at one point in the essay that the glory of the novel genre consisted in its spanning of the expanse between private experience and public context. And you can see how you stretch this idea out in both freedom and the corrections. For instance, I feel in the corrections when Gary is suddenly so desperate to buy some shares, and you go on for a few pages, you suddenly begin to see how all these large forces in human life occupy our brains and make us sometimes colonize them, and you're not completely in control of what we're thinking. Gary, as a family man, suddenly has a different identity in those moments. And it's really profound. The effects are really beautiful. But
Gary, through his parents, happens to get some inside information.
yeah,
And he's smart enough to know that some kinds of information, inside information, are legal to trade on. It all depends on how you got it. And he got it legally, so he's very keen, because his parents never made any money. He's very keen to make some money, and he tells them they should too.
yeah. And those are really beautiful effects, but I wonder when you use the word social novel, and we see it exactly how you use it, because we are led out into all these layers of like the different fragments of life in the 21st century. But I wonder what you oppose that to. What is not a social novel then? Or what do you think of the social novel as being in opposition to?
I don't think of myself as writing social novels. I think I started out trying to write social novels. Right. Basically, the 19th century is what I think of. And the novel was the premier form of entertainment. And it was the way that the middle class educated itself. And so because there was no alternative, really. I mean, you could read the newspaper, but if you wanted to find out what it was like to be in a debtor's prison or to be in Australia, the way you found that out was to read a novel. And the way the government worked. These were all topics, or what life was like in the mines. I mean, if you were Zola. There was this hunger for page after page of description of what's the world really like. Yeah. And that Harper's essay came out of this moment when you realize, well, they didn't have TV.
Yeah.
And now we have, of course, things beyond TV for acquainting ourselves. So it's clear that a lot of what made the novel such a popular form in the 19th century was that it had no competition, and that it was, geez, I feel like I'm saying everything I should be saying tomorrow, but since you asked, yes. That there was no longer a demand for that kind of information, and to try to write a laborious 19th century kind of social novel now, when, first of all, things are changing every week. I mean, the news cycle, back then it was every week, now it's every 6 minutes. And there was no demand for it. So we needed to completely just get rid of the idea of the social novel. Obviously, broadly construed, as you say, everything is a social novel, although interestingly, Robinson Crusoe, sort of the first novel, harder to see that as a social novel, since it's about a man who spends 20 years by himself on a desert island. But okay. I take your point.
Well, I also meant to ask you, it seems from the persona of yourself you construct in your essays about yourself as a writer that you lead a very monastic life, and you often spend much of the day by yourself writing. But in the books, there's a great pleasure in living in the world and in understanding the ways in which different kinds of people understand themselves. That is, there's a great pleasure in entering the lives of people very unlike you. And it seems somehow that you're both a very unworldly and at the same time a very worldly person. Or is there some other way of thinking about this relationship for a novelist?
No, I think that's approximately correct. I think in that same Harper's essay, I talk about how I came around to the notion that the people who become writers, and actually for that matter, who become really serious readers who cannot live without books, somewhere fairly early on, they formed the community they found to live in was not other people, it was books. And I was one of those kids. I spent a lot of time alone reading as a kid. And so and I've never felt alone because, you know, there was Isaac Asimov to keep me company, or Tolkien to keep me company, C.S. Lewis. There were, I mean, so oddly for me, and I think for a lot of writers are intensely social, and that's why festivals are dangerous places for them. They all go home sick because they've been socializing for 18 hours at a time. But there's a real attraction to setting up your own little world in which you can be social. Every morning I go and see the friends who I created for myself. It's kind of pathetic if you put it that way, but you know, I'm an adult who has imaginary friends, which is kind of a short description of a novelist.
Yeah. Oh, no, I just meant to, by way of peripheral detail, I mean, when I read the sentence in your books, like this one here about Gary Lambert, where you say today, the sentence begins today, so it's as if you know what he wears every day, but today Gary was wearing a caper green half-silk sport coat, an ecru linen button-down, and pleatless black dress pants. It sort of suggests that Gary is a very painstaking dresser, but also that you seem to know all the latest fashion trends.
Well, that was circa 1999, but some things are timeless, I guess.
Which one of those three that he's wearing? The pants, maybe.
Maybe the pants, yes. Well, again, Gary is basically, he's a banker. But he likes to think of himself as a special banker,
yes.
Who dresses a little better than the other bankers.
Yeah. I thought that was a delightful touch because he wants to come across as a man of leisure.
Yes.
In the banking world.
Exactly. True enough.
Right. Well, I have some questions about other writers who are influences on your work, especially two who I like very much myself. It's just somebody showing me a sign that we don't have a lot of time left.
Okay.
You can speak for as long as you like, Jonathan. Well, I meant to ask you about someone whom a lot of Indian readers don't know at all, and maybe this is you know, you've written an introduction to one of her books, so maybe this is the time to speak about her. The Australian novelist Christina Stead, who had a similar way of, sometimes I think there's clear similarities in your work, and who sort of had a similar way of like going up and down between a mind at work and a city at work, if you know what I mean. And what influence has she had on your thinking about the novel?
We're talking about Christina Stead. Her last name is like Instead without the in. It's just Stead. She wrote what, every time I say this, I think, no, that can't be true. And then I go back and I reread the book. I say, no, it is true. She wrote one of the truly great novels of the 20th century. It's on my top 5 list. It's called The Man Who Loved Children. And one of the things that's confounding about it is that it seems, it's not the easiest novel. One reason it's not an easy novel is The Man Who Loved Children is this kind of preposterous narcissistic father who teaches his children to adore him in Washington, D.C. in the early 40s. And one of the ways he controls his family is he makes up a private language that they all have to speak. And so it takes a little while to figure out how to read the book because there are all these bracketed explanations of what the family is actually saying because he is so totally taken over that family. You would think that that fact alone would make this like one of the 2 or 3 key feminist texts of the 20th century.
Yes.
I mean, because it sounds sort of theoretical and programmatic when I put it that way, but the book is so vivid and so not programmatic and so not theoretical and so even-handed and so actually weirdly sympathetic toward that father that it's a marvelous, marvelous novel about a family. And it's Well, I'm just confounded that it's not, that people are not posthumously carrying Christina Stead on their shoulders around the town square, frankly, and installing her as the first thing you read in every women's study program around the world. But of course, I'm a guy, so maybe I just don't get these things. But seriously, it's a wonderful book. But what's interesting is that she was this incredibly engaged with the world woman. She was engaged with communism. Her novel preceding The Man Who Loved Children was an 850-page novel about banking called House of All Nations. You have not read it?
I didn't read that.
I've read maybe 200 pages of it. It's a little dull. It's kind of, it looks like something you'd expect the 60s American postmoderns to have written. It looks like something Gaddis would have written, or Pynchon, or even, well, the list goes on and on. So she was totally thinking in terms of the big picture.
Yes.
And in this one novel, she went back to her absolutely unbelievable childhood in Australia and wrote the book as a kind of personal vendetta against the young woman who her father eventually married.
It's a very strange novelistic project, but it really works, doesn't it?
She inscribed the book, could be considered a private letter to this young woman. So it's a weird book, but it does sort of like right in the middle of the family story, suddenly we go to I think it's the Philippines for 70 pages where the father is doing sociological research. Well, I'm just going to put in a strong pitch for that book.
Well, when listening to you talk about that, it seems to me that also what you're saying is that sometimes we overvalue ideas or setting in a novel, and when we should be thinking about it more closely in terms of aesthetic success, and that's a category that every novel generates for itself. It's not a method that you can bring to the reading of novels. It's what you find out when you read a book.
Well, you know, people construct aesthetics based on, novelists construct aesthetics that typically tend to foreground what the novelist is particularly good at.
Right.
So I think character is good, and one reason I love The Man Who Loved Children is that there are all these really, really good novelists, people who are canonical, people we read 100 years later, or who are writing now, who we will be reading 100 years from now, who go through their entire careers, and they never produce a character who really is like an iconic, great character. Christina Stead does 3 of them, 3 world-class characters in one novel. Each of them, I mean, just incredibly, so that's my aesthetic, and I would say that does trump a lot of other things. It's like, you know, I don't need the ideas. I've got Sam, Henny, and Louis, and that's enough for me. Because and that's what I remember every time I go back. I think, well, what is that book? It's just a family thing. And then I get back and it's like, oh my God, does she get those 3 characters? Oh my God. And I'm blown away all over again.
Yeah, I think what great characters do is they allow you to escape from your own subjectivity because you begin to think like them or after a concerted sort of encounter with them.
I think that's right. And I think, again, if you accept the notion that the novel is somehow bound up in the development of the individual, development of the idea of the individual, what could be a greater novelistic achievement than to produce a fully realized, unforgettable individual whose subjectivity somehow you experience as if it were your own. I mean, that's...
Well, I'm going to ask you only a couple more questions before we head out to the audience, but...
Our time is tragically brief here.
It is. We'll chat later. We're on stage again tomorrow. I've got some leftover. Whatever's left over, I'm going to check tonight.
We have to make the others be quiet.
You will handle that because I don't think I can. There's some other big names up there. Well, Since we're speaking about characters, it seemed to me, and here I'm going to bring in I.B. Singer, who's a great favorite of mine, that one of the ways in which characters can be developed is by letting them kind of reveal themselves instead of trying to analyze them. And you do this very successfully in your books by letting characters speak to one another for long stretches of time. And you have a very good ear for dialogue. And this seems to me, it's a very successful way of letting the narrator just drop out of the story for a bit and letting the reader meet the characters, sort of almost dropping them into the sofa, onto the sofa with them. And do you have a particular way of writing dialogue or thinking about the place of conversation in a story?
I discovered after some years that I speak all my dialogue out loud when I'm writing it. I'm completely unaware of it. I was horrified when I realized the reason I kept being hoarse at the end of the day was that I'd been talking all day without being aware of it for a minute. So, yeah, it's fun to write dialogue. I mean, all you fiction writers in the audience know you can kind of relax. It's just dialogue. It's not the terrors of prose. But there's something nice, especially as I move toward more telling and less showing, really away from scene.
Yeah.
That you can sort of tell, and then when you need a break, it's almost visual, the relief that the broken up look of dialogue on a page provides, that you could kind of get this rhythm going where you would do a bunch of telling and then arrive at a scene and you actually didn't have to do the whole laborious, she was sitting on the sofa, he was sitting on the whatever, and outside the trees were gently stirring in the breeze, all of that stuff you don't have to do. You just say, until one day she went to him and said, dunk, and then you have dunk, 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 and then you pick up the story, you can go down again, and all of this sort of scene setting drops away because the dialogue kind of goes directly to the brain, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Anyway.
Just off the cuff, I meant to ask you, sometimes one knows that you are having a little laugh at your characters when writing dialogue because they are making flat statements that they don't mean to ask a question, but they end with a question mark, which is a kind of tick of American speech you pick up. What is it in American speech that creates this effect, you think?
That's a profound sociological question. I don't know. I think the importance of sitcoms in my generation's development cannot be underestimated.
Right.
Basically, what life was 4 or 5 hours per day watching things with a laugh track. And so America's not an innocent force, but after we saved the free world by entering into World War II, there were some decades where we felt pretty good. And we're far from everything else. It's like, okay, there's a mess in Europe and the Pacific. We'll go help take care of that. And then we'll come home and be isolated again and kind of forget the horror of the world. And something about, but not really forget it. So you have to have irony to deal with the dissonance between this willed innocence and the actual not innocence of the country. And you have to laugh a lot, and everything's about being funny, and I don't know.
That was very fun.
Okay, fine.
A great
Maybe we should go to the audience since we've got some...
We've got 10 minutes.
9 minutes.
Okay.
Did you, I didn't want to cut you off if you had one zinger last question.
No, I've got you on stage again tomorrow, so whatever's left over, I'll just ask you separately.
Okay.
Who wants to ask questions now? I will please forgive me if I don't, we don't get to you, because I will try and move back and forth, but you, ma'am. Right here.
Thanks for a very interesting insight into a writer's mind. I just have a small question which I'd like to ask you as a reader of other people's work, how do you discriminate? What are the factors which are important to you, and how do you use that paradigm, or no, not paradigm, I would say, how do you use those factors which are important to you as a reader in your, how does that reflect in your own writing?
There are so many things to read and not so much time to do it, especially nowadays. So I'm looking for reasons to not read a book. So one of the things I do is I read a few pages, and if there's trouble in the prose, if there are cliches, really even one cliche in the first 3 or 4 pages, I can't do it. I won't, it's like life is too short to read a writer who does not recognize a cliche and remove it. And I will sometimes open it in the middle and read a page of dialogue. Does this person have an ear? And it's not really fair because, I don't know, did Sophocles have an ear? I don't know. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it's all tin-eared dialogue from Oedipus. But still, that's, you know, those are a few things. And those, again, correspond to things I care about when I'm writing. So I'm trying to make the page clean, trying not to waste the reader's time. And I kind of feel like if it works at that detail level, then maybe the person is taking care at other levels as well and is not doing something familiar.
Somebody from the back? You, please. Yeah.
Microphone coming your way.
Thank you. If there is one writer that you're often clubbed with, it's David Foster Wallace, whom you are pretty good friends with. But you're completely different writers. You know, if there is one thing that is common to both of you, it's that you're both ambitious. So why do you think you guys were often clubbed together? And would you ever write what would be described as a postmodernist novel, you know, with a lot of big ideas? I know you mentioned that characters do for you what ideas do for other novelists. But would you write, say, an Infinite Jest or you know, The Crying of Lot 49? Not necessarily of the same type, but something which is ambitious along those lines. Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, you named two of my favorite novels in that mode, in Lot 49 and Infinite Jest. I think Dave and I, you know, we were both from the Midwest. We were friends for 20 years. And I think crucially, even though we got together trying to talk about why you would still write fiction in a television age, in a computer age, and I think we at root had very similar notions of why you might. We were both ambitious and we were competing. And when you're competing, like in a family, if one brother totally rocks at chess, probably you're going to say, I'm going to be the baseball player here. And so I actually think my effort to differentiate myself, and I think his too, to individuate vis-a-vis the other person, because I looked around and like, whose talent here do I recognize among my peers? Well, you know, in 1987 there was Dave, and that effort to become, well, I tried to develop my strengths, and I think he did too. And so that's why, even though even though our methods are really seriously different, there was that linkage that was actually love, was the linkage, love and competition, competitive love or loving competition. So, yeah, my first novel was a little bit more in that vein, actually. The one with Indians in it, which we haven't talked about, thank God.
Someone from that side at the back? Yes, you're right at the back.
Thank you all for coming out today. It's toasty here on stage.
I'm interested in knowing the kind of setting you require when you're writing. Do you like a particular environment? And what kind of state of mind are you in when you're writing? Is it easy to get inside that state of mind, or does it take a lot of withdrawal? Do you need to be in a quiet place?
I like to be half asleep, so I work first thing in the morning. I like a cold, dark, silent, bare space to work in. You're trying to have a dream, and places that are good to sleep. I just described a place I like to sleep. So, cold, dark, silent, and bare. And you wouldn't think bare matters when you're trying to sleep, but if you're aware that there's like really ugly furnishings on the wall, lots of them, it's distracting.
Next question. Yes, you please.
Where are we?
Thank you. Corrections is the story of a family and also the separate stories of the individual members of that family. I wonder how you construct that as a writer, whether you work on it, whether you wrote it more or less in the order that it appears on the page, or whether you have to write it as a number of separate stories which you then interleave as part of the editing process.
My method is such a mess that it should be an example only as what to avoid. The first thing that I wrote for, actually the very opening, the short chapter I wrote very early on, and then the next thing I wrote was the middle chapter, the cruise ship chapter, at which point I threw away hundreds of other pages. Is that some sort of signal?
No, you can go on. We've got now the 3 or 4.
I got very taken with the novella and the short novel when I was struggling in the mid-90s. And there was particularly Kansabra Owe's novel, A Personal Matter. Heart Be Still. It's a fantastic book. Read it if you haven't. He deserved the Nobel Prize, and he got it. And also Paula Fox's short novel, Desperate Characters. There was something about the cleanness of the arc and both of A Personal Matter takes place in the space of maybe 4 days, 5 days, after the main character is informed that his wife has given birth to a monster. And Desperate Characters is just a weekend after the main female character has been bitten by a possibly rabid cat. That's all it is, and yet both of those, that short book, A Personal Matter, is like all of 50s and 60s Japan in there. How? By following the one person as he runs from this terrible news he's heard. And the same thing, Desperate Characters is a novel about the 60s and 70s in America. How? Following the inside of a woman's head after she's been bitten by a rabid cat. And I loved it, and I also realized I couldn't do it. But I thought, well, what if you do that? Because I like to turn things around, so I can't buy into just one point of view. It makes me nervous, one point of view. So it did eventually occur to me that I could get that same sort of intensity in these these arcs within a larger framework. So yeah, then I wrote Gary, then I wrote Chip, then Gary, then Denise, then the last. Yeah, more or less as it is.
Okay. Last question, and then we're done. Yes,
there is, thank God, a last question.
Mr. Franzen, I was just wondering, you were speaking earlier about sort of the postmodern novel sort of being about men writing long stories about big ideas. When I think about last year's Nobel Prize winner, Alice Munro, writing almost only about women and children and exquisite stories, all in the short form. I mean, lots of other writers come to mind who did the short story very, very well. Don't you think that really there were these other things, but a white male-dominated world never recognized it till now?
Sorry, what was
that? A white male-dominated world did not recognize that there were these incredibly wonderful people writing short stories, women writing a lot, and so on and so forth.
It's been a scandal for years, and finally the people throwing darts at the Swedish Academy hit the bullseye with that one. Yeah, it's like, has a pure short story writer ever won the Nobel Prize? Not until this year. So no, it's a fantastic thing, and I think it's a very hopeful development. And they're playing the music, so I think that might mean I'll have to cut off before I go on about Alice Munro. Thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Chandrahas.